Chia. This day.
No, Your Honor.
Name the record for the defendant.
No, Your Honor.
We may invite the jury in.
We're still missing one jury.
Let's bring all the ones we got here in.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you found in your seats notepads and a pen, so that if you want to, you may take notes. The purpose of any notes that you take, they are an aid to individual memory, and they prove nothing to anybody else. The memory of any juror is entitled to the same dignity and respect as the notes of any other juror. Remember, it is an aid to your individual memory and proves nothing to anyone else. We're now ready for the opening statements of counsel. The purpose of these opening statements is narrow and limited. It is just an outline of what the lawyer believes the competent and the admissible evidence will be. Opening statements are not evidence and must not be considered by you as evidence. The lawyers, if they desire, may waive making an opening statement. The defendant, if she desires, may reserve making an opening statement till just prior to her presentation of evidence if she desires to present evidence. Does the state desire to make an opening statement this time?
Yes, Your Honor.
The jury is with the state of North Carolina.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. More than 12 stab wounds, 5 to the back, one so forcibly inflicted to his jaw that it shattered his dentures, dumped, with his shirt pulled over his head, abandoned on the side of the road. That is the way that the victim in this case, Mr. Jose Perez, was found on the morning of June 16th. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lauren Freeman. I am your district attorney, and me, along with Deborah Shandles, an assistant district attorney, will be presenting to you the evidence by which you will find this defendant guilty of first-degree murder. Today, my job is quite simple, as the judge has said, and that is to try and provide an outline, a framework of what the evidence will be. This is unlike many of the cases that we have here in this courtroom. This is not a case about who did it. This is a case about what was in the mind of the defendant at the time that she killed her husband, Mr. Perez. There are a few things as you get ready to listen to the evidence that I want you to know about. First of all, I want you to know about the victim. Mr. Perez, as you've heard during jury selection, was a Vietnam veteran. He was a father, a grandfather, and a friend. He was like many people who've moved to our community in the last few years. He'd come here to spend more time with his grandchildren, the children of Vanessa, who is here in the audience today. Having served in Vietnam, he was disabled, and you're going to hear a lot of testimony throughout this case about some of the physical limitations that Mr. Perez had, including the fact that he had neuropathy, diabetes. He had had a liver transplant. At one point, he had suffered from cancer. His doctor had even prescribed for him special tools to allow him to eat because he had limitations with the way he could use his hands and with his ability to balance. And so they were in the process of trying to install a ramp to get in and out of his house. Mr. Perez was also, as you've heard us discuss, a recovering alcoholic. He had been sober for 40 years. He took his recovery very seriously. He went to meetings repeatedly every week. He also helped others break the power of addiction over their lives. It was at one of those meetings for recovery that he met the defendant, Miss Madonna, in 2009, and they shortly married thereafter. As we've talked about, the purpose of this case is to try and determine what happened on the night of June 15th. We will have the responsibility of proving to you beyond a reasonable doubt what the intent of the defendant was at the time of the death of Mr. Perez. As you think about how we prove somebody's intent or what's in somebody's mind, I would ask you to pay attention to certain particular things. Those things include what exactly the defendant did leading up to the incident in question and what happened immediately thereafter. You are going to hear testimony that on the day of the murder, Miss Madonna went to South Carolina to visit a family member who was dying of cancer. It was from that family member that she obtained the knife and a gun. The knife that you will hear was found at the crime scene. And she obtained these items by telling this dying cousin of hers, or dying relative of hers, that she was afraid because there had been break-ins in her neighborhood. Break-ins, folks, that you will hear never actually occurred. You will hear testimony during the course of this trial from crime scene investigators and from law enforcement. They will tell you about how when they served a search warrant on the house of the defendant and the victim on the night after Mr. Perez's body was found, they found in the garbage bloody clothes, a zap stick, a knife box matching the knife that was found at the scene, and even the defendant's wedding rings. You'll also hear how on the day of the murder, she planned a date with a man whom she had recently started a romantic relationship, and how on the next day, on the following day after which Mr. Perez was killed, she in fact went on a date to this gentleman's house. You're also going to hear, folks, about the different stories that the defendant in this case told about what had happened to the victim. Stories that she told his daughter, stories that she told law enforcement, stories that she told an attorney. And you will see through the inconsistencies of this story, it will tell you what exactly was happening with her at the time that this murder occurred. Folks, we appreciate, and as the judge has talked about, you will be hearing a lot of evidence in this case. I know y'all have been here since yesterday morning, and you are ready to get started. And we want you to hear all the evidence in this case. And just as the judge has indicated, after you've had an opportunity to hear all of the evidence in this case, we want you to go back to the jury room using the law that he instructs you on. And we want you to use your common sense and your good judgment, the same judgment you use every day in making decisions. And we ask that at the end of all the evidence, you return a verdict against Miss Joanna Madonna of guilty of first-degree murder. Thank you.
Any desire to have an open statement made at this time?
Yes, Your Honor.
Curious with the defendant.
Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show you that Joanna Madonna is a mother, a teacher, a nurturer, a protector, a caretaker, a survivor. She is not a murderer. Joanna was adopted at birth by John and Ann Madonna. She grew up in upstate New York along with her adopted brother. Her parents raised her with a good moral compass and a good Catholic upbringing. But her childhood was not without difficulties. Her father was an alcoholic who drank 7 days a week and was constantly at work. And her mother always had a very tenuous relationship. And their relationship would get even worse through her teenage years. At 16 years old, Joanna dropped out of high school, began living on the streets, went job to job, and she started down a path of drug and alcohol abuse, which ultimately led her to a full-blown drug and alcohol addiction. It was during this time in her life, while she was living on the streets, that she would be raped twice, once at 16 and once again at 18. Her mother had a stroke later that year while she was 18. While a terrible event, it might have been a saving grace for her because it got her back home. Her dad called and asked her to come home and help care for her mother, and she did. She re-entered high school, ultimately graduated, and enrolled in Fordham University. Unfortunately, at 22, Joanna's mother suffered another stroke, a massive stroke this time, and she passed away. Although Joanna was still drinking and getting high, she continued to stay home to care for her father. Despite her own addictions, she managed to graduate from Fordham University. When Joanna was 24, she would again be raped, this time by her drug dealer. It's fair to say that she hit her bottom at that point. Compounded with the past rapes she'd suffered, she had significant post-traumatic stress. And with the help of a recovery program and a sponsor, she was able to get sober. 3 weeks later, she would learn that she was pregnant as a result of that rape, which gave her more incentive than ever to remain sober. Her daughter, Rachel, was born September 9th, 1992. Rachel's father refused to get sober, and Joanna cut all ties with him. While she was pregnant with Rachel, she met John Lopez, and they were married shortly thereafter. She would have her second child, Michelle, on January 17th, 1994. And while John Lopez, her husband, had brief periods of sobriety, he could not commit to a fully sober life. And Joanna, having 2 children and her father to care for, couldn't risk her own sobriety. And she asked him to leave, and they ultimately divorced. Due to a very unfortunate turn of events, John Lopez would later commit suicide years later as a result of a failed relationship. Joanna was a single mother for the next 8 years of her life. She struggled, as most single moms do, but she got by the best she could. She was teaching school during the day and with the help of her father caring for the girls in the evening, she returned to school to attempt to get her master's in education. It was around this time that Joanna met Charles Chuck Pritchard, as he goes by, and they began a relationship. She was very drawn to him because he was also a single father who was supporting his family. They were ultimately married in 2003. She would have her third and final child, Isabel, in 2005. In 2007, Joanna would also be diagnosed with fibromyalgia. And in 2007, her and Chuck decided to move the family from New York down to North Carolina. They were having significant financial issues with the cost of living in New York. It was adding a strain on the relationship, and they thought a move would be good for the family. Her father sold his lifelong home and moved with them down to North Carolina. Although Joanna knew that the move was the right thing to do for her and her family, it didn't relieve the financial and marital strain that was happening in the relationship. Her and Chuck also had known for quite some time that something wasn't quite right with their daughter Isabel. It was also adding strain in the relationship. They would later find out that Isabel suffers from autism. This was another added pressure on their relationship. Despite the great love that her and Chuck had for each other, they ultimately decided to separate. Joanna will count this to you as one of the saddest times in her sober life. But despite these difficulties, 3 things remain constant: her undying love for her children, her faith and belief in God, and her continued sobriety. It was around this time that Joanna met Jose Perez in recovery. She was recently separated from Chuck, and he was still married at the time. They began a friendship, and as that friendship developed, he left his wife and would ultimately move in with Joanna, her 2 girls, and her father. Early in their relationship, Jose told Joanna that he didn't have long to live, that he was dying of cancer. This would be the first of many lies that Jose would tell Joanna, although at the time she was unaware that he was not being truthful with her. But her nurturing side took over, and she began to care for Jose as he lived with them. And she began and grew to love him. And on September 14th, 2009, they were married. Both recently divorced. And there was signs of stress in their relationship at a very early time. Jose started admitting issues with chronic lying. And in 2009, January of 2009, even before they were married, he sought treatment for that. He would tell his counselor that it was destroying his life with his girlfriend and threatening their relationship. Joanna at this point knew that he did not have terminal cancer. He was not dying. But he promised to change and began to go to therapy to address the issues he was having with lying to her. They even attended group therapy together. And Jose was not a healthy man. He had many ailments, but he was not decrepit. He was not sitting in a chair, not living life. He did a lot of activities. He did housework. He did yard work. He volunteered at the VA. He played with Isabel. When he was falling on health issues, Joanna often took care of him. She would take him to doctor's appointments, and on several occasions in 2013, when he'd have episodes with overtaking medications or not taking enough medications, she would call 911. She would take him to his doctors. After years of marriage, Jose's lying hadn't gotten any better. Quite frankly, it had gotten worse. He was simply living a lie. By December 2012, Joanna discovered that he was cheating on her with another woman. And after 40 years of sobriety, she believed that he was drinking and misusing his medication. Over the course of their almost 4 years of marriage, 5 years of dating, every time Joanna would bring up the issue of a separation, Jose would threaten suicide because he said he didn't want to be alone. And Joanna took this to heart, obviously knowing what had happened with John Lopez, her first husband. She knew that somebody was capable of carrying out such a threat. So despite the deterioration in their relationship, she didn't push the issue. She cared for Jose and didn't want him to hurt himself. So every time it was brought up, the issue of separation or divorce, it was quickly swept under the rug, and life continued on. Joanna hid these problems of her marriage and her personal issues, not even telling friends and family. She did seek out treatment from a therapist around this time to help her deal with all these emotions she was bottling in. While Jose was never physically abusive to Joanna, he was very controlling and very jealous. She seldom went anywhere alone, including recovery meetings and band practice. She was very concerned about her safety and ability to take care of her children if she became a single mother again. This was also compounded with the issues she had with post-traumatic stress disorder. It often left her in debilitating fear. She was self-admittedly codependent on Jose. In March 2013, Joanna gave up her teaching job to be a full-time mother to Isabel. She was often getting suspended and having behavioral issues at school, and Joanna had planned on homeschooling her in the upcoming school year. At this point, they were primarily living off of Jose's income, which is a disability check and his Social Security. Approximately $5,500 a month was coming into the household from those things. Joanna maintained small part-time jobs to help contribute to the family, but they were essentially living paycheck to paycheck. And this got even worse when Jose started borrowing money from friends and not paying it back, not paying bills on time. After almost 4 years of marriage, Joanna, after much reflection, decided to ask Jose to leave, and also for him to seek treatment for his relapse. She was nervous to approach him because every time she approached him, he would threaten suicide. But she was firm in her decision, and in 2013, she began to tell friends, including Danica Dale, who you hear from, and her daughters, Rachel and Michelle, that she was going to soon ask Jose to leave. On June 15th, 2013, she had plans to drive down to South Carolina to visit a family member. It was the nephew of her ex-husband, John Lopez. He was dying of terminal cancer. That morning she left. She drove down to South Carolina. It was about a 4-hour trip. She took Jose's Jeep. She called both Rachel and Michelle on the way down there and told them that she had planned that evening when she got back to ask Jose to leave. She wanted to know if either one of them would be home because if things got heated in terms of an argument, she did not want them to be around. When she got to South Carolina, she went to Billy Lopez's house. He was the brother of John Lopez, her deceased husband. They then went to his son's house, William Lopez, the individual, the teenager dying of cancer. And when she got there, she was shocked to see him in the condition that he was in. And so conversation clearly turned to what he loved, which was guns, swords, weapons. He had a quite extensive collection. And throughout the course of their conversation, it was brought up that Joanna was interested in purchasing a firearm to protect her family once she separated. And William offered up a knife and a gun and told her to take it. She initially declined, but ultimately accepted his offer and told him as soon as she had the money to purchase her own, in a couple weeks she'd come back and return his items. The visit wasn't long. William's health was pretty bad. And Joanna got back on the road to North Carolina. On the 4-hour trip back, what he might do to himself because of all the past threats of suicide. It never crossed her mind, actually, that he would be physical. She was replaying the speech over and over in her mind to make sure she stayed firm in her decision to ask for a separation. And when she returned home at approximately 7 p.m. that evening, she realized that one of the girls was upstairs. So she quickly goes in, she changes her clothes, she asks Jose to go on a drive with her. And he does. They run some errands, they go to the Dollar General, they go to a gas station. And within a short time from that, she begins to confront him about his drinking, about his pill usage, about the cheating, the lies. She tells him that she is finally asking for a separation, and she's going to drop him off at his sponsor's house, which is within the neighborhood they were in, short distance away. She encourages him to go to rehab. He becomes furious. He is screaming at her. And all of a sudden, he tells her that he's about to have a heart attack. He starts clutching his chest, acting as if he's going to have a heart attack. Joanna immediately pulls over. The first place available is a church parking lot, and she pulls over. She came back around the back side of the Jeep to find Jose already outside of the vehicle. He had a firearm, and he shot it twice. Luckily, it missed her. And then he turned the gun on himself, and she immediately rushed up to him, and a struggle ensues over the weapon. And Jose is shot. She believed him to be shot once in the face and maybe a graze to his arm. They're no longer arguing. He's talking about walking home, but he's conscious. And Joanna said, "Are you crazy? We've got to get you to the hospital." And she manages to get him in the vehicle, and they head towards the hospital. Once she finally convinces him to go to the hospital, she wanted to go to Wake Med. He insists on going to the VA where he normally gets his medical treatment. So she headed in that direction. And while they're on their way, he's bleeding in the Jeep. He has been shot. He's bleeding, trying to clean out the wound with a soda. But he becomes furious again. Between English and Spanish, he's cursing at her. He's blaming Michelle for her wanting a separation. And again, he says he's about to have another heart attack or be sick. He's making gestures. And again, Joanna pulls over at the next place available. And she comes again, back around the back side of the Jeep. And as soon as she gets around, Jose pushes her on the chest. And she immediately falls to the ground. The wind is completely knocked out of her. And the next thing she realizes is that Jose is on top of her with his right forearm against her throat. And she looks down and notices at that point that he has a knife and that she is bleeding from her arm. And at this point, she can't barely breathe. She's thinking every breath might be her last. And in that instant, she knew that she had to fight back or she was going to die. She had never seen someone in so much rage. And by then, luckily, Jose had dropped the knife, and she picked it up. And she started using it. And she used it, quite frankly, until she could get up. When she was able to actually get up, she took Jose's shoes off and threw them at the wood line because she was afraid he was going to get up and come after her. She also took the knife and threw that towards the wood line so he couldn't use it against her. She got in the Jeep and she went home. She was in complete shock about what had happened. She had just experienced the most traumatic event of her life. She couldn't believe that her husband and her friend had just tried to kill her, and worse, threaten the life of her daughter. She didn't even realize at that point that Jose had died. She truly believed that he was still alive and was going to go to his sponsor, Fred's house. She does make some irrational decisions in the next 24 hours. She gets home and she doesn't call the police. In fact, she talks to her daughter, Michelle, and gets her involved in the situation. She cleans out the blood that's in the Jeep. She is so upset with Jose that she cleans out all of his belongings from the house and puts them in trash bags and puts them in the garage. She uses Jose's phone to call family members and friends and tell them that he is going down to Florida to rehab. She tells Rachel and Michelle that Jose attacked her as a result of her asking for the separation, but that everything will be okay. She truly believes that Jose could come back at any point. She starts researching on her home computer separation agreements, protective orders. She contacts a friend about changing the locks on the house. While frightened, she goes about that next day as normal as possible. It is not until that next night, Sunday the 16th, that law enforcement notifies her that Jose Perez passed away right there on the side of the road. You will hear testimony from several experts in the case, one of them being David Freeling. He will tell you that Jose Perez had gunshot residue on his left hand. This will corroborate what Joanna will tell you about the events that happened that night. This entire incident is tragic. Not only did Jose unfortunately die as a result of these events, but it left Joanna and her family in shambles, as well as Jose's. There was absolutely no reason for Joanna to want Jose dead. She simply wanted a divorce. And because of Jose's actions, she had no choice but to defend herself. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to listen to all the evidence in this case. And once you do, you will determine that Joanna Madonna is not guilty. Thank you.